Hello everybody and welcome back. My name is Jenna and I'm the producer for the Roxborough House Roundtables at Jefferson East Falls. Each episode is recorded and later posted on our YouTube and SoundCloud for anyone who wasn't able to attend the live event. You can also tune into our broadcast on the first and third Sundays of each month from 7 to 8 a.m. on G-Town Radio 92.5 FM WGGT. Today's roundtable is hosted by Thomas Jefferson University student Liana, who recently returned from studying abroad. In this discussion, we'll explore Liana's study abroad experience and then her research on the global reach of Trumpism, an ideology that blends populism, ethnic nationalism, and anti-establishment rhetoric, and how they extended beyond U.S. borders to shape political movements in France and Britain. And now I'll hand it off to Liana to begin the discussion.
And which one should I speak in? Any of them? Okay, perfect. Yeah, so first I wanted to thank you guys for coming to my discussion. I'm really excited to have this reflection on my study abroad experience and sort of, share the insights that I learned, when asking people and gathering opinions on, the current political climate of our country and more importantly, the rise in Trumpism. So within my research paper, I find Trumpism as a blend of populism and ethnic nationalism in the sense that we're trying to encourage the public to really, I'm trying to think of the word to say it. We're trying to encourage the public in a divisive way to really, align their views with Trump and really feed into the sort of propaganda that he's been disseminating within the country in terms of, policies like immigration, abortion, really far-right conservative ideologies. And, when I did go abroad, I wanted to really bridge the gap between America and, the impact that it's having on other countries. Because, when we're on social media, it's an echo chamber. We can't escape, the opinions and the viewpoints that our algorithm feeds us, right? So when I went over, I was like, I want to, gauge the opinions of, my peers at my international university, the University of London in Paris. And I also wanted to gain the sentiments of my professors and then anyone else who was willing to share a little bit of inside information on how politics really revolve within Europe and the EU Union. So for my first point,
even before we get there,
yeah.
Just to procedurally, I want to take you through, you went there, I want to know your experience, and then we'll get into your research.
Yeah, absolutely,
okay?
Yeah.
Why did you decide to study abroad?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I always knew that I wanted to study abroad in high school, so I took French for 4 years. I was really heavily involved in my AP French program. As vice president, we had a certain obligation to kind of steer away from political topics, in terms of, French history, politics play a really large part, as we've seen. So I feel like this was a really great opportunity to really take what I'm learning, in my current discipline and really expand those viewpoints and kind of see what the other side of the pond is experiencing in terms of this political divide that we're experiencing right now.
And just to take it from a procedural point of view, how did you actually go about doing that? Who did you contact? How did it work?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I had the idea on a whim one night, and then I was like, I want to look more into it and see, what the process is to apply for study abroad. So I went to the study abroad, site on Jefferson. I read more into the programs and what different university, partnerships they offered and, what was available for our major for law and society. So we did have two options. It was between John Cabot University in the UK and then University of London Institute in Paris, France. The deciding factor between the two was just my innate love for French culture and the language. I really wanted to travel outside the U.S. for my first time and really just get a good understanding of what's going on, not just solely in the U.S. So, that process looked like reaching out to Madeline, the Study Away office, seeing what, programs they offered, what that process would entail, what housing would look like, what my counselors over there would be expecting when I came over. So it was a lot of deliberation between how I was first going to get over there and then what I was going to do once I got there.
So once you get over there, you talk about counselors, where to live. Take us through that. How did all that work?
Yeah. So upon my arrival, I met with my landlord, and I was going to be spending the next 5 months there. So it wasn't a really short trip, it was something that we really needed to kind of like discuss like at length. The language barrier was very interesting at first. I wouldn't call myself very affluent in French language, but you know, my landlord Laurent, he was very accommodating with you know, trying to help me out and kind of get me acclimated to the French environment, because it was my first time traveling outside the U.S. for the first time.
Did you set up your own place to live, or was that something arranged through our university or through University of London?
So it was coordinated through our university. We reached out to a third-party like service, and we were able to go through all of the housing options depending on my budget, what I was looking for in location, just like a bunch of different factors like that.
And I know you and I had discussions about ULIP as well. Were all the students, were they all Americans, or was there a mix?
There were hardly any Americans at ULIP. It's an international university in Paris. So they did have like an American university sort of affiliated with ULIP, but it was like on a different side of the city. So for this university, yeah, there was like a lot of different international students. We had students from Russia, we had students from, you know, Poland, other neighboring countries, and then it was a largely British student population because they all came from, you know, Britain.
So being in a classroom with not all Americans, but actually a mix, how would you compare that experience as opposed to just being in a classroom with all Americans?
Yeah, I mean, going into it, I thought that language would be that like unifying factor. Like, okay, like as long as we can stay on the same page and speak the same language, we're good. But there were a lot of like different, like very subtle like cultural differences between the way that they, you know, host their seminars, the way that they, you know, go about instruction and things like that. You know, the seminars there, they ranged around the same time, so around like 45 minutes to an hour long. Class sizes were generally small. I didn't have to worry about feeling overwhelmed within the room. And the instructors, they didn't really, like, depending on the type of class that it was, so we did have seminar-based instruction, and then we did have lecture-based instruction. The lectures, they were very dense in material. I think that was probably the main difference that I realized between here and, you know, ULIP. We would go through different units, you know, every single day. So, for example, one of my classes was contemporary French politics, and that was my lecture-based class. So, you know, we would go in probably around like 15 to 20 students. He would introduce, well, this was the first day of class, so he introduced sort of, you know, the syllabus for, you know, the semester, very similar to here, and then, you know, he just jumped right into the first topic. So I think that was really the main difference that I realized at first, was that, okay, like, we have what's called syllabus week here, so it's like, you know, you go to class, you go over the syllabus, and then, you know, you cut loose for the day, but we just, like, hopped right into it, and I think that's what really, like, got me, like, engaged at first. It was like, okay, like, we're really down to business now.
Just overall, you were away a long time.
Yeah.
And have you ever been away anywhere near that amount of time?
No. So I left in January, and then I came back in the beginning of May. It was my first time traveling out of the country, so I had to go through the visa approval process. I had to, you know, get my passport, you know, get all of the documents, you know, squared and in order. And then, you know, once I got over, I was just like, okay, this is where I'm staying, and this is where I'm gonna have to, you know, live and sort of like, you know, acclimate myself to the new environment.
So what was that like?
It was very overwhelming, and I'm going to be very transparent about it. When I first came there, I realized that the French are very different in Americans in sense of the way that they view people who they know or not from the country. So when I first got there, you know, I tell this story every time that I tell people about my study abroad experience. I went to the airport. You know, I had all of my luggages and everything, and then, you know, I'm looking around like, okay, like, I don't know where to go now. And then, you know, my phone, I haven't established a connection yet, so I have no Wi-Fi, no way of contacting anyone. And then, you know, this airport, you know, employee approaches me, asking me for help if I need anything. You know, I get a little bit of information from him, but I'm still trying to figure out where my flat is and where I'm supposed to, you know, report to for the first day. And then, you know, I remember vaguely hearing over the PA speaker, you know, don't accept any sort of taxi offers or Uber offers outside of the designated airport, you know, affiliates or whatever. And then I just completely just like grazed over my head. So then, you know, this guy comes up to me, he's like, where are you looking to go? Like all type of stuff. I look so American with like, you know, my beanie, my puffer, you know, like I'm just such a, you know, oddball in that aspect. But he drives me to, I'm staying in the 10th arrondissement, so I'm in like the very center of Paris. So it was probably like an hour and 45-minute drive with traffic. It was just insane, and it was nothing like I've ever seen, at least here, in terms of like, how much road congestion there was. Like, mopeds like driving in between, semi trucks, and like, people walking out in front of cars. It was very different, even from like New York, you know what I mean? Like another major city. It was just like so like just different than anything I've ever experienced. So, yeah.
So you're a bit overwhelmed.
Yeah.
So when do you become whelmed?
That's a great question. I became whelmed when I first set foot in my flat. So when I first arrived there, I was trying to get in correspondence with Laurent, and then I wasn't able to contact him or reach him through the phone. So I'm at the correct address. I'm just like, how do I get in? So miraculously, I'm knocking on the door and he hears me. He comes down, and then I'm like, okay, I can like breathe for a second. So then we go upstairs. We talk about just like regular apartment stuff, like the heating situation and like, the water and all that type of stuff. And then he leaves, and then like the jet lag just hits me like a truck. So then I'm like, I'm supposed to go to ULIP on my first day, and then I have to, I had to contact, the person at ULIP who was helping me, and then, I had to be like, I can come in tomorrow, but I think I really just need this time to just like, settle myself and just kind of get myself situated with my environment. But I feel like once I was able to recognize that like, I was where I was supposed to be, and then, I can just kind of go from here. I think that really like eased my nerves a lot, so.
This is a broader question, but how do you think you've changed and matured through the experience?
I think I've honestly changed immensely, and when I tell people about my experiences with study abroad, I really tell them about how individualistic this program was compared to other study abroad programs that we offer at Jefferson. So, I had friends who were studying abroad in Italy, friends who have studied abroad in other countries, and, you're still within that like Jefferson community when you have other students from, Jefferson coming with you, dorming with you, kind of experiencing everything for the first time with you. So I think that was really the main, not disconnect for me, but it was the main difference between that. It was, okay, I have to figure out how to navigate the metro by myself. How do I get a metro card? Like how do I get to school? How do I, apply for my school ID? What is the classes going to look like? How do I get food? It was all these different things, and I think it was very uncomfortable. And I think that was what was most rewarding about it, was because I was able to sort of put that aside and be like, I know that this is a learning experience, and that, with uncomfort, it comes like, realization and self-actualization. And I think I was really able to like forge that misunderstanding that I had when I first came there, of being like, okay, I don't know if I'm gonna fit in. I don't know if I'm gonna be able to really, get myself adjusted to this environment. But I think I tell people honestly, around month 4, I think that's when I really started like getting in the groove of things, because it does take a really long time. You're in a whole different country and a whole new environment, and I think that was really when I was comfortable navigating myself around the city, because the city's huge. I mean, and so many unfamiliar faces, so many different people. It was fascinating, but it was so scary at the same time. So I think the biggest change that I experienced personally was just like being able to like take initiative and being able to like navigate challenging situations by myself, which is vastly important.
You feel your confidence in your own abilities was raised because of the experience?
Yeah, and even being at ULIP, a lot of the discussions that we had, it was very different than what I experienced here at Jefferson. I mean, they're each unique and rewarding in their own respective manner. But I think at ULIP, I was learning about things that I've never learned before, because we have such an American-centric education system. So, being able to learn about, French history, being able to learn about, I took a class on climate politics. That's something we don't offer here. So I was able to learn about all of these new technical terms and, different like concepts. And, it was just like a very like all-encompassing experience in that aspect.
Before we go into the research, is there any questions regarding the experience of study abroad or that we should cover before we get into that?
I think, what are some things that helped, like when you think back on preparing to study abroad, and what are some things that would help a student prepare for a similar experience would be one of my questions.
Yeah, so for a student either looking to study abroad or they're in the process of it, I think a really good thing is keeping in contact with people at home. I think, you know, it's very easy to feel isolated and to kind of like drive yourself into like, you know, being a hermit and staying inside all the time. And, you know, I think to my own fault, that is what I experienced for, you know, a good portion of the trip. I was kind of scared to go outside because I was like, you know, this is like so unlike anything I've ever experienced before. And it was like, my mind was still trying to like grapple, like, okay, like I was in America like, you know, 10 hours ago, and like now I'm in this like whole different country, and no one speaks a lick of English. I mean, if I did find someone, then, you know, they were either from America or they learned English on their own accord. So I think the biggest thing is just like having a good support system and, you know, staying in contact with, you know, family, friends, and then also just like having someone to be able to vent to when you do find yourself frustrated and when you do encounter roadblocks, because they're definitely going to happen. So,
Any other questions on study abroad? Overall, did you have a good time?
I did have a great time. I did, and I don't want to make this seem like a very, you know, like, you know, scary thing or a thing to, you know, kind of want to come away from. Like, you want to embrace that, and you want to like let yourself fall into it. And I think, going back to like what you said about, did this change you as an individual? I think one of the best things that it's helped me learn is to kind of like fall into like, you know, uncomfortability and falling into like difficult situations, and then asking for help too. You know, I found myself being like, okay, I'm a study abroad student, you know, I'm coming here, I did all this by myself, and I felt like I had to do this by myself because I didn't have anyone there. But, you know, when I opened up at ULIP, and when, you know, I talked to my advisor and my counselors, and, you know, I even talked to people at home, I talked to you, you know, just being able to like share the reality of your experience while also acknowledging that like it's like such an amazing, you know, opportunity to, you know, study abroad. I feel like that really helps you like gain a better understanding of what the experience really means.
And just to set up before the research, the one, I wouldn't say issue I had with study abroad is it's usually 12 credits. And that puts the student behind a bit where they have to overload on one semester. So that's why I made this arrangement with the study abroad office where we have an independent study between, that's why we met every other week or every week, I forgot how many times, talking about the research and so forth. So this way you walk away with 15 credits, but you're also walking away with doing research in a foreign country, which is a really unique opportunity to get different points of view and so forth. So that leads to your research. Okay, so why did you pick your particular, go ahead.
Just a note on that, that's one of the great things when you're picking your program, we met about different courses and how that works and how that fits together. And so that structure where you're able to do that independent study allows you for some of that flexibility to explore these projects and still connect it to the courses that you and here. So that was a nice, like, it's a really cool model and cool thing that you all we were putting together.
And to add, I think that was another thing that I really loved about this experience was like how tailored it was to me, you know, because I wasn't in like, you know, a group program or something where I could get, you know, like extra benefits for like flights or like, you know, housing and stuff like that. Like, you know, Study Away, Madeline and Justine, they did a really great job of like, you know, helping me figure out, okay, what courses do you want to take? What are you looking for in a class? How are we going to align this with your current curriculum at Jefferson and, you know, achieve the amount of credits that are necessary? And I think it was just a really, I agree with Madeline, it was a great model. So
now getting to your research, why did you pick the topic that you picked, and how did you go about doing the research?
Yeah, so I had chosen the topic when I had gone over there first. So it wasn't a predetermined thing that I, you know, had decided, but this was right when Trump got reelected. So I was thinking and reflecting about, you know, the disarray that our country was in and, you know, sort of the conflicting opinions that I was hearing on both sides. And then, you know, I came over here and funny enough, I turned on the TV and Trump was the person that came on the TV. So, you know, it was in French and, you know, there were subtitles and I was just watching it, and believe it or not, it was like probably like every other channel, it was something regarding, you know, US relations or, you know, something happening in the news. And I was like, I didn't really fully understand how much of an impact it was having until I got there. And then I was like, okay, like people are still talking about this even when the election didn't even happen in this country yet. So I think that's what really drove me to, you know, choose that topic. And then I really wanted to first get like a student-centric point of view on the election and how that affected, you know, the students at ULIP. And then I also wanted to try to see if I could gauge, you know, a general French sentiment on Trump, on Americans, on American politics. And then that's where I found myself with this topic.
So before we even get to him, how did you feel yourself treated as an American? Just a little backstory. When I went to India, that was the first time he was elected.
Yeah.
And I had situations where people, because I'm obviously American, and come up to me and go, how did you do this? You know, why did you do this? I mean, I was to the point that we started instructing people to say we're Canadian, because it became a point where we just didn't want to get into a discussion every 5 minutes when we're outside with different people. Even when we went to their version of the New York Times of India, and we met with the publisher, and we had a beautiful conference room, and the first thing he comes into our group, he goes, what did you guys do? Was the first thing. So it became almost overwhelming.
And the attitude of starting with politics, you know, in the U.S., that's kind of people slowly ease their way into it. In other countries, people can be much more upfront and comfortable talking about it. It isn't as personal of a discussion.
So with that, did you experience any of that?
Yeah, so I think that's kind of a two-part question. So I think for the first part, in terms of how I gauge the perception of the French towards me, I mean, within any country that you go to, like, you will stick out like a sore thumb, you know, because they pick up on mannerisms and body language and, you know, all of these different things that you normally wouldn't think of, you know, when you are here. So the way that I walked, the way that, you know, my American, like, dialect bled through, you know, like, a lot of the students were, like, very fascinated with the way that I talked. And I was, you know, it was, like, things of that nature. And then, you know, when I was on the street, you know, I feel like you wouldn't really be able, you wouldn't be able to really tell that I was American if I was just walking down the street as like an individual. But I think also just like the way that I dress, like I dress in a more casual manner, and the French, they're very known for being like, you know, very formal and very like chic and stylish. So that was another thing. I came and I was like, I feel very underdressed on the street right now. Like, you know, they had trench coats and everything, and like everyone blended in, and, you know, everyone was really, like, it was very tunnel vision when I was like out in public, and when people were, you know, kind of like conducting themselves in public. Everyone was on their best behavior. People speak very quietly, you know, in public. It was very different as someone growing up like in Philadelphia, you know what I mean? So, yeah. And then the second part to that question, I'm trying to remember what it was regarding.
Coming up to you and talking about politics.
Yeah. So, I would agree with Madeline. The way that the French they kind of tiptoe around politics. They're very, it's a very, what is it called, personal thing to them. Not in a way in which they literally align themselves personally with like politics. It's just like, that's not really something that you bring up in public. You know what I mean? It's more for private conversations. I asked a couple of my peers, not even really like family dinner conversations. It was really just like, when we were in class, that's the time to talk about it, you know, and like, even questions regarding like race or, you know, other type of things, like the French, like they don't concern themselves with that, and some of them found it quite offensive.
Really?
When you do bring up, you know, things of that nature. I remember, you know, as a biracial student, when I went over there was another girl in my class, and, you know, I asked her, hey, like, where are you from, all this type of stuff, and she was very like hush-hush about kind of like, you know, her own experience and stuff like that, because it was like a predominantly, you know, white, you know, university. So I think that was also a really interesting thing, because here we use that as it can be a very divisive factor, but it can be a very unifying factor, talking about your background and, you know, your own experiences. And I think that was something that really caught me off guard. So, yeah.
So getting back to your research, so what was your initial thesis? What were you trying to discover?
So I was trying to discover, kind of to sum it up very straightforward, how Trump's current policies and, you know, considering his past administration, this current administration, in the terms, kind of how they're influencing global politics, how they're influencing, you know, far-right leaders and organizations in different countries, and, you know, sort of trying to bridge different parallels between the two. So I think that's what I really wanted to focus my thesis on. And me and, you know, Evan Lee, when we were, you know, on Zoom, we were like, what is a good way to, you know, make this research credible, to make this, you know, something that's like really grounded in like, you know, facts and like, you know, statistics and stuff like that. So we decided on conducting a survey and a poll. So that's what I did. You know, I conducted a poll with different questions. I tried to think about things that we were currently learning in, you know, the classes that I was taking, and trying to apply them to this like independent study project, sort of blending together a lot of the different themes that we've been talking about, with like hegemony and like, you know, dominionism and like religion and politics. And it was just like so much information. And I think in order to pin it down, I really just wanted to focus on what the other side felt and, you know, how British and French people felt about it. So
why don't you discuss your findings? What did it reveal?
Yeah, so I think I'll just kind of briefly go over what the questions sort of looked like on my poll. So the first one was just talking about political engagement, and I did find that a lot of the students within ULIP, they were politically engaged during the 2024 US election, which was something that I was very surprised about. And in terms of their engagement, it wasn't the engagement that we think of here, where it's like, okay, we're, you know, talking on social media, we're spreading the word on voting, you know, things of that nature. It was like they were engaged solely through social media. So I think that lens was very attractive to me because they were getting, I don't know, I don't want to say it was like a broader view of, you know, the situation occurring in the United States in terms of the election, but I think I think that it was more narrow in the sense that, you know, social media, as we know, it can be very like misguided, and it can, you know, have a lot of misinformation. So a lot of, you know, the sentiments that I gained, they did bear a lot of truth, but a lot of them did stem from like a lot of misunderstandings about what we were experiencing as Americans in the country.
You know, it's interesting that they, as much as they care about what's going on here, because I think if we took a poll of our students here on who's the Prime Minister of France, I would think it'd be probably 0% or even care about what's going on in France. So it is interesting. It seems they care a lot about what's going on over here.
Yeah, and not necessarily for the sake of Americans, because I feel like, you know, the general sentiments towards Americans in general, they're very diverse in that aspect. Some people, they really couldn't care less what's going on over here. Other people, it was really just a means to understand how this is going to impact their country and, you know, global politics in general. So, you know, keeping up with the news, keeping up with, you know, Trump's policies, and, you know, that first like week or two when he was elected, we saw all of these things shooting out in terms of, you know, executive orders and things that he was pushing. So being able to like ask them that and be like, you know, is this anything that you've ever experienced before in your country? And like, is this something that we should be worried about? I think that was like a really important conversation that I had with them. So.
Moving on to the next question.
Yeah. So the next one, I really wanted to focus on the educational aspect of it, because when Trump was reelected, we did see a destabilization within our education system, within that whole department in that industry. So I asked, do you think Trump's reelection will impact students in higher educations or young professionals? A lot of them took a firm stance on how it will affect European security and tariffs, because that was when the very brief, well not brief, but the tariff war was happening. And they were also talking about, you know, how it would affect, you know, pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement, international treaties that we have. So they were really taking a very broad perspective in terms of like that question. So that was really interesting as well. And then I had asked them, how do you think Trump's reelection will shape the U.S.'s position in global politics, particularly concerning Europe? So I got a lot of varied answers with this one. A lot of them were, you know, regarding the strain between the two countries, because, you know, we have been allies, and, you know, we do have a lot of correspondence in terms of like matters of international relations. And, you know, when Trump did, you know, start that tariff war, a lot of the French in France, you know, they really took a firmer stance in their grievances against Trump. and, you know, how unbegrudgingly, like, flagrant he was in his, you know, dissemination of those policies, and how really he didn't really give it much consideration in that aspect. So, you know, asking them about it and gaining their sentiment, they said that the European government is struggling to work with him, and that a lot of citizens here, you know, they feel like as America is a global superpower, you know, having Trump at the forefront of that, it could really make or break a lot of, you know, the established, you know, systems and policies that they have enacted in the EU. And then another question that I wanted to briefly touch on was, do you believe Trump's recent decisions reflect Americans at large? And with this, I think this was a very important question, because a wide misconception that people in foreign countries have about Americans is that we are very, like, defending, you know, a lot of the actions that the government was, you know, sort of doing at the time. And, you know, a lot of the times that's not the case. Most, you know, Americans, they're very neutral in their political, you know, understandings and their, you know, ideologies. And I feel like because the media was, you know, sort of echoing and, you know, platforming a lot of, you know, right-wing ideals, you know, it was being reflected at large when we were looking at how people were perceiving our country. So being able to, like, sort of also have to bridge that misunderstanding and being like, well, a lot of people here aren't happy with what's going on. The French were kind of like, okay, well, like, we have a very extensive history in revolution, and, like, you know what I mean? Just, like, you know, telling our government, you know, when and where they can exert such, like, excessive force. And I think something that a lot of the students who I talked to over there were confused about was, why hasn't America done anything? You know, because what we've talked about in class, America has such a, you know, a strong belief in their, you know, First Amendment rights, and, you know, a lot of their protections within the law. Why are they not using that to their advantage to really, you know, tell the government that, you know, the people want change? And that's something that I also struggle to kind of come to qualms with too.
And you're uniquely out of the country when a lot of things are happening, and so just personally, how are you handling all this?
It was very distressing. A lot of the information that I was getting, I was really trying to, you know, do more research than I normally would here, because I was in a different country. So, you know, I was looking at different news outlets, looking at different publications, also looking at social media as well, and a lot of fear-mongering that was going on during that time. And, like, I'll admit, like, it did bleed into a lot of my, you know, conceptions about what was going on and stuff like that. And, you know, being able to have this project as a way to sort of ease that transition into being into a new country, and, like, easing the understanding of, like, how bad it was at that time. You know, like, my peers were saying, like, we're really scared for, like, what's going to happen. And, like, you know, a lot of the people here and the, you know, PA lawmakers and stuff like that, like, they were really trying to, like, scramble around and, you know, kind of get their head on their shoulders. So I think for me it was kind of like times two, because I was, you know, so far away. Yeah. And then another question, it was mostly regarding the executive orders. They have slowed down considerably compared to the beginning of his administration, but I just kind of wanted to gauge how the students were viewing the veracity of the, you know, executive orders, and if they were really taking it seriously. So, you know, I was talking a lot about, you know, the attacks on LGBTQ individuals, you know, their autonomy and their rights in terms of, you know, how they could access gender affirming care, how they could, you know, navigate themselves within this very tense political climate. A small percentage of the students kind of, like, cared about it. And I think that was really interesting as well. I don't really know if there was a large, you know, LGBTQ community within that university, and I think that was also something that was different versus here, because here we have so many different student identity groups and organizations, and we have a lot of people bringing up those conversations. So for that to kind of be, like, on the back burner, that was really interesting as well, to kind of gauge their viewpoint with that.
I could ask that question, because that's very interesting, because at least in this university in the Northeast, because we can't generalize the rest of America, but students are very open and very transparent about their different genders and so forth and preferences. And it's talked about very easily in class by most. Did you see that there, or is it more hush-hush? Is it a different type of situation?
I wouldn't say that it's hush-hush. I did meet people who did align themselves with, that identity group, and they were just very like to themselves about it. I don't think it was necessarily like, oh, I can't really talk about this in the way that race was, because, another, thing, which is true, is that Americans do put a really large emphasis on race in terms of how we navigate our politics and how we navigate relations with people within our own community. So with that, people, they were fine with, talking about, their own, gender identity or their, sexual expression or things of that nature, but it just wasn't to the degree of how much we embrace it here and how much we embrace the differences between students, faculty, just like our general community. So, yeah. And then another one was he wanted to implement further actions to address and prevent anti-Semitism within the U.S. A lot of people thought that heavily aligned with the interest of Americans, which I also thought was very interesting. At a university level, I wouldn't necessarily agree that we see that much of an alignment, but on a broader level, in terms of like, federal powers and people, in those positions, we did see a lot of like legislation and, sort of agendas kind of not being pushed, but being really encouraged in terms of, protecting a lot of, the Jewish population within America during this really like tense time within our like political landscape. So I think that was also really interesting as well, because a lot of people thought that was really like at the forefront of our, political agenda. And then I also wanted to kind of talk about more so the actors in the situation. So when I was doing my research on, not even necessarily far right, politicians, but it was just more right-leaning politicians, because what was so different about learning about the French government, the UK government, their system is so vastly different compared to ours in terms of, the amount of, political parties that they have and like their representatives and stuff like that. And it was very interesting and insightful to really dive into, but it was also very confusing as well, trying to understand, where all these people lie, how they interact with each other, what's the communication between parties. Definitely not as hostile as here, you know what I mean? Not as much of a competition or, things of that nature, but it still was an election, and it still was, we need a winner, you know what I mean? So looking at, the different actors in that sense, I really did a lot of research on, more specifically, Marine Le Pen. So she is the leader of Le Rassemblement National, which is the far right-leaning party within France. So when I was looking at a lot of the different, I guess, behaviors that were sort of mirrored by Trump, I really wanted to understand that dynamic and how, before this administration, a lot of world leaders weren't as emboldened to really speak so bluntly about different, what is it called, like problems and issues, such as like immigration or, like people seeking asylum and things of that nature. So she really employed a very us versus them narrative in a lot of her campaigning and, a lot of her, platforming. And I thought that was really interesting, because we're seeing something very similar over here as well in terms of, we need to push these people out, and we can't let them come in because they're going to destroy our job market. They're going to, take away our opportunities. And
poison
I think,
our blood and all that stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So, she was eventually, I think during that time I had read that she was indicted for embezzlement. That was one of the controversies that she had kind of caught herself up in. And I thought it was very ironic, because Trump was the first one to really jump to her defense and be like, okay, well, we need to really we need to look over, I guess, like the bookkeeping error in that aspect, and did she really commit fraud in that aspect, you know what I mean? And I think that even that opinion and him sort of sharing those words, it really like showed the dynamic between political elites and sort of how there is a large emphasis on sort of protecting themselves in their position and not really letting a lot of those secrets or a lot of those controversies kind of come to light. So I thought that was very interesting as well, because he hasn't spoken on her since. So,
And then, so that really just set the question for me, how does this administration set a precedent for how elites behave themselves without fear of reprisal? You know, there is an importance to holding, you know, political elites accountable and, you know, seeing people for what they are when they do commit illegal acts, you know what I mean? So when that did happen, I was really questioning, like, are we really looking at this the right way in terms of how the U.S. is treating Trump and his wide array of charges and, you know, illegal acts? And is the French doing the same thing? Are they holding their, you know, political representatives accountable for the things that they're doing as well? So that was something that I also encountered during my research.
Do we have any questions for the panel?
I was wondering, when I've traveled abroad under different presidential administrations, there's been different flavors to some of the questions or some of the reactions to elections. And I noticed a difference between, you know, the first election of Trump and the second. Not so much as some of it is what's going on in the U.S. of like, wow, this happened, he's elected again. But it was also the shift worldwide. So we've seen across the globe a number of right-leaning or far right-leaning politicians getting elected. So the conversation became more or less of this is a U.S. thing versus well, we've got this going on here versus there. Were there parallels when you talk to folks about politics, either, you know, French or British or someone from another country? Did they draw parallels that you didn't expect when talking about political leaders in different countries?
Yeah, and I think that really like lied at the epicenter of like what, you know, my project was about, because I wasn't anticipating their opinions to be, you know, that much aligned with mine, you know, because, you know, when I had come over, I was still drawing those parallels and trying to understand that global landscape and that aspect of like, okay, well, this country, they're dealing with this leader who's trying to rise to power, and they're trying to sort of emulate that same, you know, charisma and that same sort of like appeal that Trump has. So when I was asking, you know, people in the UK and, you know, who came from the UK and people in France, they were saying that I think the French less so. I think some of them really appreciated what Trump was doing, and I feel like that's something that I really couldn't glaze over. You know, as much as, you know, the student population and the people that I talked to, they really shared the same sentiments about what was going on. A lot of people were still very set in their conservative ways in that aspect, and they were saying, you know, Trump, he's creating a global paradigm shift in terms of how we view politics, how we view the integrity of the law and things of that nature. So, you know, and it's mostly, you know, older French people who, you know, who are native to France and who have lived there with the, you know, tourists coming in and out and things, you know, sort of changing globally. So I think the generational divide was really what was like the largest factor in that. So,
how did the stereotype of Americans change while you were over there? Because I already know the regular stereotype, we're fat, we're stupid, all that stuff.
Yeah.
But how did it like work when you went during the election?
Yeah, I think it was a lot of those same sentiments, but it was mostly just like, you know, are Americans like okay? You know what I mean? Like, you know, like first of all, are they okay? And then like, do they have the capacity to digest what's going on right now? And then also, you know, use their own understanding of like, you know, political protections and the law to combat what's going on. And that's what we weren't seeing, was that combating, you know, defensive type of nature, which we should have employed towards the beginning of like, okay, we see something going wrong very quickly, very rapidly. How do we stop it, nip it in the bud, and then, you know, just like cease it from happening? So I think that was really the largest thing. It's like, you know, I'd be like, okay, I'm from America, and then it'd be like, oh, okay, like, you know, just like, here we go again. So, you know, it was a lot of those, you know, same understandings of like, you know, Americans aren't really either as politically involved as they should be, or they're not educated, you know, enough to really make such like crucial decisions within like our decision-making process.
Did you notice the difference between the French and the British students as far as their attitude towards America or its attitude towards Trump?
No, I wouldn't say so. I think the British were more vocal on their opinions about Trump. They were a lot more, you know, willing to just be very like blunt and honest. They weren't afraid to mince their words. It was difficult because a lot of them did have a blended background of French and British. A lot of them spoke the language very well. They had been living there for years. Some of them had parents who were French, some of them, you know what I mean? So there really wasn't a necessary divide between the French students and the British students. It was really just like all these like European students, you know what I mean? Well, if we're speaking in like a pre-Brexit, terminology, but
Geographically
European. But I think the French, I think the judgments that they held, I think they very much mirrored the sentiments of the British, but I think the British students, they were more vocal about that, and they wanted to understand why it was happening more. So.
What would you say are the major differences between like American conservatism and like MAGA or anything like that versus like you mentioned the French far right party? Are there any differences or how are they similar?
Yeah. So, and this was something that I sort of touched on in my paper. I feel like the main difference between the MAGA movement that we've seen here versus the French is that we don't have that same parasocial relationship and that same what is it called? Like idolizing, politicians in that aspect. Like they still held them to a very high regard, and they really aligned themselves and encouraged a lot of the ideas and things that they were trying to push. But in terms of MAGA, it was a more like unwilling type of thing. You know what I mean? It was like, okay, like a lot of people view Trump as like a messiah of sorts, and someone bigger than God. So I think the main difference here, which we've talked about in a lot of my law classes at Jefferson, is that like what's going on with the MAGA movement is more of like, it has more of like a cultish sort of undertone to it. And I think that was the largest difference, was that the French weren't as like involved with that as we were here, which I found very concerning. But it also made a lot of sense too, because I feel like our descent into like MAGA and Trumpism and things of that nature, it's a very American thing to happen. And I couldn't really see the French sort of acting in that same way that we do here. So, good question. Thank you. Yeah.
What do you think? Since I also went abroad last semester and I went to Italy, and I, in my experience, noticed there was a lot of older men who would wear the MAGA hats and would openly talk about their kind of admiration for Trump. Where do you think that difference is from the people in France to the people in Italy?
Yeah, well, I mean, and that's another thing, is like the MAGA like symbolism and the signature, that wasn't really something that we've ever experienced before within our country. Like we've had political campaigns and we've had merchandise and advertisements, but to the degree that it has been with Trump, it's unprecedented. So that was so striking when I went to go to Rome and I saw people on the streets wearing MAGA hats, and I was like, oh my goodness, like this is a bigger issue than I thought, you know what I mean? And it was like, because of, I think to answer your question, I feel like a lot of that ideology does stem from like, Italy's history with fascism and like authoritative power, and how a lot of conservatives within Italy, they find comfort and they find security within that. And I didn't get a chance to speak to many Italians when I was over there, but I did really, it was a very different climate compared to France. So I think that was what was most interesting about being over there and seeing like the differences. We're still in Europe, but you go to a whole different country, and then it's like all of these political dynamics and all of these like relationships, they just like change so drastically. And I think that was so surprising.
There's like different aspects of MAGA or these different political things that have connected with movements in each of those countries, or like historical precedents for that get latched onto, it seems.
We're running out of time. So
Oh, yeah.
so very quickly, your conclusions from your research.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think my largest conclusion was just, as we talked about, this like very Americanized phenomenon of Trumpism what it's becoming, how much of a, pertinent global leader he's becoming within, our world's history. It's something we're seeing in real time, and, especially for our generation, for Gen Z, we've never experienced this before. Growing up, in the midst of the Obama administration, there were, there were drawbacks to it, there were pros to it, obviously, but in terms of this, I think, growing up in this very polarized political climate, it's very necessary to, recognize the patterns when they're there, and then, not think so tunnel vision in terms of how America is dealing with this issue, but also how other countries are responding to it and how other countries are also embracing it in certain parts of it as well. So, yeah, I think that was my final conclusion for it.
Last question, would you recommend people to study abroad?
Yes, absolutely. 100% 10 toes down. I think studying abroad, if you, for whatever reason you find yourself even attracted to the idea of, doing study abroad, I would say just look into it no matter what. I would just say, look at what Jefferson has to offer. If you go to a different school, look at what your school study abroad department has to offer. And then really, depending on your discipline or what your interests are, you can really cater it to what you want to experience when you are abroad. So, even when I was abroad, I was able to, visit museums and, landmarks and visit libraries and the massive archives that they had there. So there's so much information that you can gain and so many different perspectives that you can gain from studying abroad, and that's what's so valuable about it. So I would definitely recommend it to anyone who's interested.
Come visit us in the
That's
Study Away office.
It's a good way to end the podcast here.
Thank you all for joining today's important discussion on how Trumpism continues to influence political landscapes beyond the United States. A special thank you to Liana for sharing her research and firsthand experiences with study abroad. As global politics become increasingly interconnected, it's vital that we examine how ideas cross borders and impact democracy worldwide. Remember, all Roxborough House Roundtable episodes are available on YouTube and SoundCloud and are broadcasted on the first and third Sundays of each month from 7 to 8 a.m. on G-Town Radio 92.5 FM WGGT. Follow us on Instagram at Roxborough House Roundtables to stay updated on upcoming events and discussions. Thanks for listening and have a great day.